Raising an adopted child who has experienced trauma, abuse, neglect, or prenatal substance exposure means learning how to talk to them about the hard things that happened before they joined your family. These conversations can feel really challenging for families to consider, and parents often feel overwhelmed about what to tell their kids, when to tell their kids, and how to support their kids once they've learned the information that a parent has to share. Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption, foster care, and kinship care. I'm Tracy Whitney, the content director for creatingafamily.org and the host of both of Creating a Family's weekly podcasts. I am joined today by Kelly Weidner, who will help us navigate these difficult conversations with our adopted children. Kelly is the co-founder and executive director of Haven Adoptions and Family Services in Ambler, Pennsylvania. She has 28 years of experience in foster care, residential care, and adoption services. Welcome, Kelly. We're so glad you joined us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with a brief overview of some of the things that adoptive parents would consider to be difficult parts of their child's story. What are some of the challenging conversations adoptive parents are tackling?
Sure. Conversations are going to be based on a variety of factors, but generally, a lot of adoptive parents see questions arise about why a child was placed for adoption, information about their birth family, and then as they get older, more details about their past. It's going to depend a lot on how old the child was when they were placed or adopted, as well as what their past stories could potentially look like. So as a child begins to feel safer in their adoptive home, and that could take years for them to get to that place, right? They are going to generally open up more about their past trauma. And then that goes into sharing details that can be incredibly difficult for adoptive parents to hear.
So what are some of the specific difficulties that adoptive parents may have to share that maybe the child has not had fleshed out or explained to them before?
Yeah, so the choices around why their parents maybe voluntarily chose adoption, addiction is a big part of a lot of children's stories. And if a child was older when they were placed in care and adopted, it could be surrounding neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, as well as, again, addiction is a big part of a lot of children's stories and choices that their parents made while struggling with active addiction.
It's also pretty common to hear about birth parents or have to tell your child about a birth parent's incarceration or maybe some circumstances that are challenging to talk about around the child's conception, such as violence or rape. Again, that prenatal substance exposure for a child with its birth mother. Why are these even necessary topics that we should consider introducing to our children?
That's a great question. Our children are sponges. They take in everything around them. They hear and see, I think, more than we think they do. And those memories of abuse and trauma could be in them, even if they don't outwardly recognize and remember them. So it's really important as these memories surface that they have a safe space in their adoptive home to talk about it and process what happened. Children who have experienced trauma, we know their amygdala of their brains is much larger than children who have not experienced trauma. So they are on more high alert and taking in even more. And inevitably, at some point, it is really important for the child to understand their history. And that does, unfortunately, include a lot of, like you said, like really painful, complex issues that stemmed from, again, violence, neglect, addiction, things like that.
And I think I know the answer to this, but for our listeners, why are some parents so reluctant to introduce these topics or to give the child the full story?
Fear, right? Fear is often a factor in our reluctancy to talk about any difficult issues. Fear of answering wrong, fear of sharing too much, fear of how the child is going to respond, and fear of what it's going to do to their relationship. A child responding with, "Why did you tell me this? I didn't want to know this." versus, or how, again, it's going to impact their relationship. We are, as a mom myself, we're mama bears and we are very protective of our children. And that scary knowledge can be very negatively impactful of a child. So I think the fear around all of that. So that's why I think it's really important. Education and training is so incredibly important for adoptive parents and foster parents to really feel empowered to talk about the difficult pieces of a child's history.
Yeah. So fear and protection are two of the main reasons. I think another reason that I see is just that unwillingness to strip innocence away from a child.
Sure.
And I think sometimes we forget if they lived it, if they experienced it, they've already had their innocence impacted. And it's up to us to flesh out that story in a way that they can cope and
Sure.
process, but then also learn how to overcome or heal.
Sure.
And
yeah,
that guarding of their innocence is crucial and important. It's a very vital role in parenting, but if they've already had their innocence impacted, we have to look at these conversations as an opportunity to kind of go back and reframe so that they can heal.
Yeah. And it's going to depend a lot on, where they are emotionally, mentally, physically. One of my favorite quotes of Glenn and Joel is we can do hard things. And that's the purpose of parenting, right? Is to teach our children it's not easy. It's not all going to be easy, but we can do hard things and we are doing them every day. And to empower children to know that and to be able to face that with the proper support, for sure.
I want to interrupt this conversation for just a moment to let you know that we want to get to know you better. Please use the link in your podcast player or in the YouTube show notes to tell us who you are and maybe let us know what your adoption story or your foster care story or your kinship story has been like thus far in your journey. We also want to know where you listen to Creating Family Podcasts and what topics would you like to hear more about to equip your family and strengthen your parenting skills. What kinds of things keep you coming back every week to listen to our 2 podcasts over and over and over again? If you use the link in your podcast player or in the YouTube show notes to introduce yourself, we will use the information we learn from you to help improve what we're doing. And we cannot wait to hear from you. And so let's go now back to our conversation with Kelly. So, what are some of the foundational steps that adoptive parents should consider when they know that it's time to start these conversations? Like, where do they start?
Yeah, so
I know.
It is a big question. When facing any difficult conversation with children, it's important for parents to process their own feelings first, right? To make sure that they are able to put aside their own judgment. Because again, as a parent, you hear these really difficult stories about your child and what they went through. It is impossible not to be judgmental, right? And to become protective. So putting those feelings of judgment aside first, in order to be able to come to the conversation with the child with an open heart and an open mind. I always say any difficult conversation should start with connection. I'm a huge TBRI fan. So connecting with the child is imperative because if you don't have a connection at that moment, the conversation is not going to be nearly as beneficial as it would if the child is locked in with you and connected. The other thing I think is important for families to keep in mind too is like what works best for the child. Sometimes those big, let's sit down and talk conversations can be way too overwhelming for a child. So depending upon what you're talking about, it might mean going for a walk, chatting over dinner, and the conversation might need to be more casual. If it is a bigger conversation, I always encourage pulling in like a therapeutic team. So the child's therapist to sit with the child's therapist and have that conversation as well, making sure that your support, the parent support team is involved in deciding how and when to have this conversation and how to start it and, continue.
I would also add, it's really important to know your own triggers and know your own history. And even if you haven't completely resolved, because I don't know. I think being able to completely resolve your own history is a myth. But if you have not come to terms with your own history and things in your child's history that might trigger unhealed wounds in your history, it's really
Absolutely.
important that you be doing that groundwork kind of underneath the surface of how you're handling what you're doing with your child. And I think the other thing that's really important is knowing your child's ability and not focusing on their chronological age and what educational experts or mental health experts might say is developmentally appropriate for this age, but understanding what's developmentally appropriate for your child, because it's a
Absolutely.
really wide range in typical children. But when you have a child who's been impacted by trauma or loss or abuse or neglect, that range is different even for them. So
Absolutely.
knowing yourself and knowing your child are two of the really important other foundational steps. Yeah. Yeah.
I always encourage foster parents as well as adoptive parents to have their own therapist that they are able to process with,
Yeah.
because you're absolutely right. Those triggers that can pop up at any time, unfortunately, can really negatively impact a conversation that could be really important for the child.
Can you give me a suggestion or two for how parents can normalize conversations about adoption in general in their homes so that when it does come time to have one of these hard conversations about that child's specific adoption story, the children kind of already have that normalization of adoption is normal in our family?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about a child who is adopted from birth, there should never be a, oh, this is when we're going to sit down and have this big conversation, right? The best answer a child can give is, when did you find out you were adopted? Is, I've always known. You're teaching your child about adoption just like you're teaching them about your parents and grandparents and the ins and outs of daily living. So it should be a topic that is covered from the get-go and always age appropriate. Right. So for the little guys, you grew in somebody else's belly, but you grew in our heart. There's so many wonderful children's books out there to talk about
Yep. Yep.
adoption and to talk about their story. And you're just always leaving the door open to have conversations. If you have any questions, we can always talk about it. You don't want to push too hard, right? Like, it's not like, do you understand you were adopted? It just needs to be a very natural conversation. And then for children who are older and adopted, through the foster care system, and obviously know their story because they remember when they moved into the home for the first time, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be leaving that door open to talk about any questions or topics that they want to talk about from their past, as well as, being open and honest about what adoption is.
So you mentioned using books with kids. We are huge fans of children's books to help introduce hard topics and new family members and things like that. So we have some great, and I'll link them in the show notes. We have some great book lists for talking about adoption with your kids. I think it's always helpful to, especially when they're young, introduce kind of that third party perspective. So if you're reading a book about a little animal who starts to understand their adoption story, it's easier for the child to kind of put themselves in the story, because this very non-threatening, cute, fuzzy animal or whatever is kind of telling the story, and they can relate to and identify with that. But I think it's also really important as our kids get older to keep adding to our library. So adding books, adding music, adding movies that center adoptive voices or that have, a main character that's experienced foster care or adoption in healthy and positive ways, and not always showing just the positive, but showing them what's out there that represents adoption and foster care in society and characters that they can see themselves in, and just making that part of your family's regular, diverse library of media that's available to your children. I think those are also helpful tools for normalizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the hardest things for a child is to have that feeling of I'm alone. I'm the
Yeah.
only kid I know that was adopted. I'm the only kid I know that's in foster
Yeah.
care. And so for families to be able to connect with other families who have adopted children, who have children in foster care is especially crucial. But these books and movies do that too. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
like I'm not alone. I'm not the only kid that's been in foster care or is in foster care.
Yeah. I mean, we all want that, right? None of us want to feel
Right.
like we're alone and experiencing whatever hard thing we're facing. We want to know that there's other people that have done it and gone through it and succeeded through it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the benefit too, like for older children who have access to, the internet, and they can look out and see, oh my gosh, there are so many other people out there that are like me,
Yeah.
whether that
Yeah.
means they're like me with the anxiety I face or the depression I'm struggling with, or, my circumstances of life.
Right. Right. Another thing about books that I'd love to talk about is life books or scrapbooks that tackle the topics that may be hard to talk about with our kids, adding information to those books as the child grows and in age
Yeah.
appropriate ways. So let's kind of pull that back a little bit and tell us what a life book is and how parents can use them effectively to talk about these difficult parts of a child's story.
Absolutely. I mean, so life books were created as a resource for the child to know their history before they were adopted. So oftentimes it's during the child preparation process. And what that is when a child is in foster care and the goal is moved towards adoption, the state provides support resources for the child to really prepare their next stage of life, right? Like, what does adoption look like? What does this mean for me? And in that process, you're also answering a lot of questions from their past too. Like, where did I come from? Where am I
Mhm.
going? So when the worker puts this life book together with the child, they're really helping them understand their story
Mhm.
and also where they're going, what this future looks like. I always say to families, I mean, imagine living in your home and wondering, I don't know if I'm going to be in this home in a month or 6 months or a year, and how devastating that would be as an adult. Our kids do this all the time in care. So,
Right.
this is a really great opportunity for them to say, okay, I'm finding my forever. This is going to be my forever. And in that, I'm going to talk about my story. And it's going to help them grow in their self esteem and their self worth by looking at all their strengths and accomplishments that the life book is going to entail, to really, it's all about them. And
Yeah.
we have a lot of children who just have never had that, right? We've never had someone say, okay, let's make this all about you.
Yeah. So, talk about how a life book might be beneficial for someone who did private infant adoption.
Yeah. And very similar in the way of which you're going to include memories that they're not going to remember, but are still a part of their story, right? So we love to use, there's a lot of actually really great storybooks right now where you can record your voice, and we'll
Yeah.
have birth moms, do that for the child. And in similar ways, so a lot of our life books have become a little bit more interactive. So they might include not just pictures, but videos, but that can include their birth certificate, their a picture of the hospital that they were born in, a letter from their birth mom, a letter from their worker when they were born,
Yeah.
a letter from their parents about the day they were born. It's all going to be the same thing. It's encompassing their history and their story.
So, families that are interested in life books can go on a search site like Amazon and just type in life books, but you
Yeah.
don't have to have the pre-made template that those offer. You can create your own just in a simple
Yeah.
scrapbook and just kind of do a
Absolutely.
chronological laying out of the child's story. And as the child grows, then you can start to add the more difficult information and be more transparent
Mhm.
about the details of information that they deserve to have as they're growing.
Right. Yeah, going off the premise of, more people to love a child is never a bad thing, right?
Right,
So
right.
for them to be able to have that connection, especially if they have an open adoption with some of their biological family, and including in that pictures, I mean, a lot of our open adoptions, they have multiple visits a year. And so including pictures of their birth mom holding them, right, as a baby. They're not going to remember that, but it's part of their story. Creating family trees, not just of their adoptive family, but also their birth family.
Right.
And, one of the other things we like to include in life books for a child of any age of adoption is, that day and time, what was,
Mhm.
especially as they get older, like what was the price of milk? Like who was the president? What was the most
Yeah,
popular, song of the time? There's so many creative ways.
right.
I know Pinterest is a big one that people
Yeah.
use.
Pinterest is a great resource.
And then our staff loves to use Canva in creating the life books too.
Okay. Okay. And it's helpful because when you include something like, how much the cost of milk was in the year you were born or whatever, I think it helps kids see where they fit in not just their family's history, but in the bigger context of the
Yeah,
world that they're inheriting as they're growing and learning.
absolutely.
What do you do if your kid wants to bring the life book to school or to share it, around the neighborhood when they're hanging out with their friends? Is that something that we should be prepared for or okay with? How do you handle something like that?
Well, in terms of prepared for, it's always good to be prepared for everything if possible, right? Wouldn't it be nice to have a guidebook and all of the
Yeah.
possibilities of what can happen with a child who's adopted?
Yeah, you're never going to be prepared for everything you need to know
Correct,
about parenting an
exactly.
adopted child.
Ever, right? My oldest is 17 and I'm still learning every day, right?
Yeah.
So, really, kind of going back to what you were saying, it's going to depend on their chronological and developmental ages because both are
Mhm.
different, right?
Yep.
It's going to depend on their understanding of their story and of
Mhm.
adoption. It'll depend on how supportive their peers are,
Mhm.
how, or the people that they want to share this with. It might
Mhm.
be neighbors and things like that.
Right.
So I would always, in a situation like this, I would always encourage families to reach out to their therapeutic support team, the child's therapist, to their own therapist, maybe they have a family therapist, to really work
Right.
together and assess the benefits of this for the child and any potential concerns that may arise. And really, when you're talking to your child about it, it's, this is a big part of your story. And we want to make sure that we explain to our children that, you know, this is something that is really important to you. And we want to make sure that the people you're sharing it with are just as excited and supportive
Yeah. Yeah.
as you are.
Especially as you start layering in the harder details and the more complex information that maybe
Yeah.
not be understood, may not be understood by those that they would be trying to share it
Yeah.
with. Yeah. Because it's a fine line.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
1,000%. And that
Yeah.
line is so different for every child that
For
we work with
every
too,
kid.
right? But with life books, I mean, it's not a one and done. It can grow with the child. The child could be looking at it and there might be milestones, there might be letters in it, there might be, pictures that the child loved at one point and doesn't anymore. And they say, I don't want this in my life book right now. Like it can grow with the child so that it feels comfortable for the child too, which is really important because it's theirs.
Yep, I was just going to say that. It's so important. This is their story and their information. And it's so important that we be responsive and treat it as a living document that
Absolutely. Mhm.
ebbs and flows with
Yeah,
their ebbs and flows and changes as they
absolutely.
need it to. Yeah. We'd like to take a moment and say a special thank you to the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption for sponsoring this podcast. The Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption believes that together we can ensure every child has a permanent, loving family. Read the stories of youth and families touched by adoption, including adoption from foster care, and access resources for parents, caregivers, and child welfare professionals at davethomasfoundation.org. So, when you are talking to a child about very complex, painful, difficult parts of their adoption story, what's some of the language that you can use when they're really young that maybe sets the groundwork for the difficult parts of that adoption story? Say a child was abused, for several months before landing in your family. How do you start that conversation when they're really young that gives them kind of the clue that there's more to come and that you'll be walking with them through it along the way?
So, yeah, I mean, I think it is obviously we want to use language that makes sense to the child, that isn't scary for the child, especially if we're talking about super young children, right? So obviously we want to make sure the groundwork is there, that they understand they are adopted and what that means to them at that age. And once you have that baseline, there are going to be questions that are just naturally going to come up, like, oh, why was I adopted? And with younger children, I recommend really just keeping it very basic, like your biological mom, whatever. If it's an open adoption, hopefully they have a name for bio mom or bio dad. But let's say they do know her first name, and they call her Peg. So, Peg was going through a really hard time, and she wanted to make a decision that was going to be best for your life. And she knew she wasn't able to support you and care for you the way that she wanted to. And so now we have the framework of the adoption. We know I'm adopted. Now we just built on a little bit of, Mama Peg, whatever we're going to call her. It wasn't in a good place. And then you just continue to grow what that looks like, right? You're not going to talk to a 4-year-old about active addiction,
Right.
but you can explain, how sometimes when you have a hard day, well, she had a lot of hard days, and
Right.
and that made it very difficult for her to make this very hard decision, right? So then you're going into the fact that this was a decision. That's for private adoption. For foster care, a lot of times it's not their decision. They don't have the choice. They are involuntarily taken from them. And so again, you're doing that same baseline framework of you're adopted, we were fostering you. What does that mean? We were taking care of you. All your mom and dad were trying to do what they could to get you back, and they weren't able to do that. And again, so there's that baseline knowledge that you're just going to continue to grow off of as the child gets older.
That's good. So let's get kind of really practical and talk about one of the probably most complex, difficult things that we could have to share with one of our children. Let's have a conversation about how to start talking to our kids about being conceived as a result of a rape or an abusive relationship, starting and then kind of building as we grow.
Yeah, that is a tough one. That is a
It
tough one.
is.
Again, there's not going to be a blanket answer. Yes,
Right.
all children should know their past history of their parents and conception. We should always assess the child's chronological age and obviously developmental age. And then really kind of assessing, like, what is the purpose of sharing this information now? Is the child ready? Is this helpful for the child in where they are in their life today? How are they emotionally able to process this information? This is one where I would absolutely recommend utilizing a therapist to be a part of the conversation with the child and and the parents through a family therapy session with that therapist support. Because that's why we have them, right? That's why we have professionals, because they know how to handle these very delicate, very difficult conversations. Oftentimes it can really be helpful to start those conversations too with a question to the child. Like it could be a general question of, if there isn't an open adoption or there isn't a lot of communication with the biological family, like, what do you know about your biological family? What do you remember if the child was old enough? Or it could be specifically like, what do you know about your biological father? That can then open up a conversation a little bit easier than we have to sit down and have this really hard conversation with you.
Right.
We're going to start with the knowledge that the child has, and then that can just make it a little bit easier to open up that conversation.
Yeah. So as another example of some of the hard stuff that we have to talk to our kids about, many times children that come to our home have been abused or neglected, whether that's in an institutional setting or it's in their family of origin. Give me a key or two for how to start those conversations.
Yeah. Again, we're going to always go back to depends on the child and their age and emotionally where they are and able to process it. They might not be ready to hear all of it until they're in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, right? Like it is important for people to know their history because it is living in them. But again, working with a therapeutic support team can be really important. Not can be, I'm sorry, is crucial and important in making that happen. Yeah. But if, for really more hard specific examples, If you're talking to a child who's in their teens, let's say, I'm just going to go with teens, and you are more familiar with their history of abuse and neglect than they are. Maybe you adopted them pretty young, and you and the team feel it's ready. The time is ready. You want to stick as factual as possible. Keep judgment aside. Um, Understanding that this is what we know, this is what was reported to us. But the reality is we're never going to know in a child's entire story. And honestly, a lot of times the biological parents don't even remember because of their own coping mechanisms of like pushing it out, right?
That's a
So,
great point. Yeah.
so sticking with the facts by, in a compassionate, empathetic, and loving way. And again, like really keeping that judgment out of the conversation as best as possible.
I think another important part of that is when we don't know, saying that to our children. I don't
Yes.
know. I'm happy to try and help you find out more if you would like to, but I
Yes.
don't know
Yeah.
that information right now. And this is what I do know, and offering them what we do know, but being so honest. I think when we can be honest like that and not make anything up, or what I hear
Absolutely.
a lot of parents doing is making up something that sounds softer and gentler, but in the kid's gut, they already know that it's not necessarily soft and gentle. So just being as true to facts and honest about what we don't know as possible. I mean, I'm in an adoptive situation where I'm never going to know details about the life that my daughters lived, the lives that my daughters lived before they came to me. I have had to get comfortable with answering, I'm so sorry, I don't know that information. And then as they've gotten older and more things have opened up in their country of birth, saying things like, but I can try and help you find that out. What's your comfort level with that? And just being responsive to that, but being willing to sit with them in how unpleasant it is to not know has been a huge factor in supporting them along the way.
That's hard. That's
It
really
is
hard.
so hard.
And it's hard for you too, right?
Yeah.
As their mom to
Yeah.
say, I have to be okay and accept that I don't know this part of their story. And that's hard.
Yeah. It's hard for all of us. I don't feel it quite as keenly as they do, but there are days that, like Mother's Day is always a hard day to not know anything. Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that you're able, I mean, to give yourself credit, to be able to have those open conversations with them, truly, and recognize that there are going to be hard days, and not judging them for that, but just showing up for them is really commendable to you. So,
oh, thank you.
It's hard.
There's a lot about these stories that is hard to swallow for all of us. So yeah,
absolutely.
Should you tell your child that her birth mother's use of drugs or alcohol were probably the primary cause of her current learning disabilities? Now we're getting really into the nitty-gritty, but these are situations our adoptive families face every day. So
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say it's really important to avoid definitively stating your mom's substance abuse caused your learning disabilities, because it's really difficult to directly link that, right? I would say nearly impossible. But what I would say is sharing with your child like age appropriate information to educate them to understand that there can be connections is a much better way to approach that situation. So just giving them more general education about substance abuse in utero, the effects that can happen because of it. But then also, I think it's very important to always follow up with that. The nurture part of life is so much more important, right? So while the difficulties that their birth mom faced could potentially have, some effects on them that have caused more difficulties, they're doing the hard things, they're working through that, and you want to do it again in a very supportive and non-judgmental way, because And again, it really depends on how comfortable you are and how old the child is, again, chronologically and developmentally,
Yeah.
in talking about addiction. But, I always say no one chooses to be active in addiction. No one wants that for their
Great point.
lives.
Yeah. And I think if we can say to our kids, especially as they're getting older and becoming more aware of their learning challenges, we can say, hey, here's what we know about alcohol during pregnancy. Here's what we know about
Exactly.
opioids during pregnancy. Here's what we know about the impacts of those things that could affect a child across the lifetime. But the good news is that mom and dad are here to support you and help you find the tools that will let you thrive in school and give you resources to learn the way your brain is wired to learn. And I think when we can kind of elevate it to this is your brain and this is how your brain learns best, we're then turning them towards coping tools because everybody's brain learns differently. And sometimes it's a result of family history. Sometimes it's a result of prenatal interruptions like drugs and alcohol. And it just gives them a way to say, okay, this is what it is. And I can't change that, but I can cope with it and process with it and deal with it.
Yeah, and education and knowledge is power, right? We are just breaking the surface as a society and learning the connections between neuroscience, brain development, and mental health, right? So I also encourage families when they are talking with their children and sharing the knowledge that they have is we're still all learning. Like there are scientists out there that have multiple PhDs that still don't have the answer to how all of this works, right? So we really want to make sure that our children understand that there can be causal links, right? However, it is something that we continue to learn because the brain is not a part of our body that we can dissect when it's working. We don't get to dive in and see how it works. And I think too, really, again, in educating our children of what trauma really is, because a lot of times kids will say, well, that's not bad. Like that, there's other kids that have been through far worse than, and really understanding that trauma isn't about the event. It's how your nervous system is affected by that event. And for children to really understand that it could be one decision that your mom made at a very difficult time that could be the cause, right? We don't know. But again, really going back to that education and empowering them in, again, a very non-judgmental way about their birth parents.
And I will tell the listeners, if you need to talk to your children about hard things in their story, like a birth parent's active addiction or a birth parent's prenatal substance exposure, we have tons of resources on our website about how to understand prenatal substance exposure and how to parent a child who is living with the impacts of, or the potential impacts of prenatal substance exposure. We've tons and tons of resources that are so helpful and are in many different mediums. If you prefer to listen, we've got podcasts. If you prefer to read, we've got articles. We've got workshops, interactive training and workshops. So we've got lots of resources to help parents understand that.
That's great.
How do you help a child who has these difficult parts of their story to grapple with? How do you help them understand how much of that story they could or should share with others kind of outside your family circle?
Another really good question and a difficult one. I would approach it in the same way I would approach a child to what they want to share with anyone, right? About their story, whether, remembering that social media is, even Snapchat, all those things are forever. Someone can take a snapshot very quickly of what you shared. Are you okay with this being out there in the world forever? I would honestly, that would probably be, again, depending on the child's age and circumstances and emotional stability, that's really the big question is, are you okay with the world knowing this information about you forever? And if there's any hesitancy in that, it's like, okay, well, then let's keep talking about it, right? And process with the child what they're comfortable sharing. But I always also recommend start small. So let's just start with sharing that you're adopted. And see the support and reaction you get from your friends. and extended family, school, peers, whatever, and let's see how that feels. Right.
Yeah.
And then you'll be able to really hopefully learn the safe people that you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about.
Right.
I always tell parents, though, too, it's their story. So it's their decision about what they want to share and when they want to share it with the parents. And again, a therapeutic support team's guidance.
Yeah. I love the running theme of including that therapeutic support team. We recommend it all the time. We feel, very strongly about that, but I appreciate that you just keep reemphasizing that, because we're not meant to do this alone. First of all, second of all, sometimes this stuff is so hard for us as adults to understand, even when we've done the pre-adoptive education and preparation, and we keep educating ourselves. So to also then have to put it in the hands of our children, it needs to be done with support and care and an understanding of what that specific child can handle.
Yeah. Yeah. Our program, our Haven's foster care program we do about 30 hours of training. And I think people are like, oh my gosh, that's so much. And I'm like, it's not near enough. I mean, I tell that to parents all the time. We scratch the surface on a lot of topics that I encourage families to continue to deep dive into. Yep. And then obviously with creating a family, we've started incorporating so many of your trainings and are just phenomenal trainings that are really supportive of our families. But I tell them, I said, look, the therapist that you're going to went through thousands of hours of education and training. Use them. That's why they're there.
Yeah. Great resource if you can find one that's going to stay with your family on the topics, the tough topics.
Absolutely.
So this is a tough question, but it does happen sometimes. What if you don't believe the story that the birth mother tells about what happened or what didn't happen? How do you handle that when you're then trying to convey those parts of the story to a child?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the only person who's going to know the whole story is the birth mother. And even then, the story is going to look very different probably in her eyes, right, than what actually happened. So it really is going to come down to not as much about, whether or not we are giving factual information. It's what knowledge is important for the child to have and how is it going to affect them and their development. I would say if you really feel confident that her story is not accurate, then don't share it with the child, right? Share what you believe, is real and true, because you don't want to share something with them. If let's give a tough example. If she did say that the child was born out of rape, and there's just inconsistencies with her stories, and the team that has been working with her through the adoption process feel that, that her story might not be true, that is not a story you need to tell the child, right? Why open up a door that is possibly very much not true.
Right. And you could say something as simple as, this is the story that your birth mother reported, and give kind of the brief summary, but we don't know yet all of the details. And so I can only tell you what she told us. And
absolutely.
And
again, like sticking with that fact, right? This is what I was told. Yes.
And doing it as gently and non-judgmentally as possible, because we don't want to in any way reflect the birth parents negatively to the child, because we don't want the child to form an unnecessary negative opinion about their birth mother or their birth father in the absence of all of those facts.
Absolutely. Exactly. Absolutely. Because you can't unhear something like that. You can't.
I was just going to say that. Yep. They can never unhear what you just said. Right.
No, absolutely.
So what if you don't know any details about something from a child's story, only that something really big or significant happened and that it was negative or very difficult? How do you handle that then?
For yourself first, right? As an adoptive parent, this is where acceptance is going to play a big part of your adoption journey. Acceptance of not knowing, and it's out of your control not to know that big information. So again, your focus is going to be on the child and their well-being and what is helpful for them to know. And it can be, that's where you really go back to that very general, your mom was in a really difficult situation. I don't know all the details to it, but what I do know is that she made this decision out of love for you
Mhm.
and for your best interest and that sort of thing. So again, really kind of to what you said for the last question, you stick with the facts and what you do know and be as general as possible. I mean, I wouldn't say something really, really big and bad happened, but I don't know what it
Right.
is. We're
Right.
not going there, but we are saying this
Right.
was a very difficult time for your birth
Yeah.
mom or whatever you call birth mom. And, again, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Body Keeps Score. If not, I
Mhm.
highly recommend it. It's in the
Yep.
child, right? That
Yeah.
trauma is
Yeah.
there.
Yep.
It's just how it's going to affect them as they grow.
Right. Right.
And then having that, their parents knowing that I can look at mom and dad and say they will be with me throughout all of this. And
Yeah.
the door is always open for those conversations.
Want to interrupt just one more time to let you know about our library of 15 free courses. Thanks to the Jockey Being Family Foundation, we can offer you this full library of free courses that are designed to strengthen your family. They will build your parenting toolkit and help you handle the things that might be challenging about your child's adoption story. You can go to bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support to take one or all 15 of the courses if you wish. And now we're going to go back and finish up this conversation with Kelly. So, how can adoptive parents help their children understand that they are more than those difficult parts of their story and that they are not doomed to repeat their birth parents' mistakes? Because I think a lot of kids think, oh, if that's what my birth dad was like, then I'm going to be just like him. Look at the ways I'm turning out just like him already. So how do we help them understand that they are more than just those really difficult, challenging parts?
So I love the example. I don't know where I stole this. I'm going to be honest, I didn't come up with it myself, but it's called like your self circle, right? So the child's here in that circle, and every day that they grow in their self worth, in their self esteem, whether it's activities, connections, succeeding in school, doing a chore well, right? All of those little accomplishments and connections with others, their circle's growing, right? And that
Okay.
circle is going to grow and grow and grow. So the difficult parts of their history are still in that circle. They will always still be in that circle. They're
Right.
just going to be a lot smaller, right? So as that child's self circle grows, it gets to the place that that's a smaller and smaller part of their history and their story. And you're showing the child, look at all these other amazing parts of your circle, right? Yes, you do have this little part, but there are so many bigger parts of
Yeah.
your story that make up who you are.
Yeah. And it goes to that conversation about the positive childhood experiences that we can provide that buffer our children
Building on, yes.
from all of the difficult things that might be inside that little circle. Yeah,
Yep,
that's great.
absolutely.
So let's wrap up by talking some practicals. Let's talk about the practical tips you can offer to support a child after we've had one of these hard to hear conversations. And I'm assuming
Sure.
that we're not going to just have one big sit down, here is all the hard stuff. This adoptive parenting thing is an unfolding of the good and the hard along the way. So how do we be present and support our children to cope with the hard things that we've had to unfold?
Yeah, I mean, and you always want to start kind of assessing how dysregulated they really are, right?
Yep.
Are they at a 4? Are they at a 7? Are they at a 9? Where do I need to meet the child where they are.
Mm-hmm.
The more dysregulated they are, the more difficult it's going to be for them to even communicate what they want or what they need at the time. I always suggest, again, we're always going to go back to connect first, asking the child, like, what do you want to do? And if the child is able to say, I need ice cream, okay, let's go get an ice cream cone, right? But
Right.
again, if the child's really dysregulated, they might not even be able to answer that question. So we're giving them choices of things we know that they love. Physical touch is a huge piece of that. Just it could be a hug, it could be cuddling on the couch, it could just be a hand on the shoulder. Again, meeting the child where they are. Making that eye contact, comfort foods, we all know we have them, and then, style of play. So giving them 2 or 3 choices of, hey, that was really big. That was a really big, hard conversation. Let's do some self-care right now, right? Let's do you want to cuddle on the couch and watch a movie? Do you want to go outside and play? Again, keeping those choices like 2 or 3. And then if they say, you
Mhm.
know what I want to do this, great. But
Yeah.
again, they might not be able to because they're so dysregulated, that just really keeping their choices to 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they're not even able to make the choice. So you say, okay, you know what? I'm thinking let's go cuddle on the couch and watch your favorite movie. I'll make some popcorn. We'll snuggle under the blanket. But really meeting them and comforting them the way they feel best. And
Yeah.
physical touch can be huge. I also say too, like for children who struggle with physical touch because of past abuse, physical touch can be really helpful with an animal. So like cuddling with a dog
Yeah.
or,
Yep.
because they're still getting that, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be
Yep.
as scary.
A favorite stuffed animal or a weighted stuffed animal, those are always
Yeah.
very helpful also. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, when you find that just being fully present, I know with the age of where we are and how we all work from home and have 500 things going on, but really as the adoptive parent, putting the phone away and just really being
Yeah.
present and showing them,
Yeah.
you realize this was really hard and you have my full attention
Yeah.
and giving those suggestions. And then, like you had said early in our conversation, just keeping that door open, at any point, you know, I will say oftentimes parents report to me, and I see this with my own children after that, they don't want to talk. They're like, we talked enough. I am
Yeah,
good.
that's sometimes true.
Right. So it might be a week or so before it comes
Yeah.
up when they say, you know what, I really need to talk about this. And again, you
Yeah.
put everything down if possible and just keep that door open.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of that check-in policy, stopping by their room after school or stopping by
Yeah.
the living room while they're watching a movie. "Hey, you doing okay? You don't
Yeah.
normally watch this movie unless you're feeling really sad. Is there something going on?"
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and again, it's that being present, not just present side by side in the moment, but being present enough to be aware and assessing kind of that watchful assessment going on anytime you've had one of those hard conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, knowing your child and every child is different. I look at my
Yeah.
3 and I know when my youngest is struggling, her answer is if I say, are you okay? I don't know. Okay. But that I don't know also means she doesn't want to keep talking. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then, I have my oldest who I'll get the okay, is everything okay? Yes. The short answers of, okay, you're clearly something's going on, but you're not ready to talk about this. So
Right.
you know that the door is open. Not and what I mean by that for both of those examples is not pushing.
Right.
We really have to let the children come to us when they are ready to talk about the
Yeah.
difficult
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for your time today and for your expertise and your wisdom. It's obvious that you've done a lot of this work with not just your own kids, but with the families that you're supporting and serving, because it just shines through in how you talk about them. And I really appreciate your child-centered approach to this conversation, because what's difficult for one kid may not be that difficult for another kid, but it's all about knowing what that kid needs and how to meet them where they're at with the difficult things that they do need to know about their own story. I appreciate your time today so much. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.